For what purpose did monarchs start borrowing money?
In almost all cases, in order to fight defensive and offensive wars.
Dr. Eichengreen, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Let's start with some basics here. What is public debt? Is it different than, say, sovereign debt or national debt?
It's different and it's the same. So
Okay.
when economists and historians talk about sovereign debt, the sovereign, of course, is the king or the highest power. So
Yeah.
sovereign debt means debt of the highest level of government. Typically, when we talk today about sovereign debt, we mean the debt of the central government or the national government. And when we talk about public debt, we are combining, aggregating the debts of the central government, the states, municipal governments, and
Oh, interesting. Okay. So
that's the way I
public
think.
debt, the way you describe it, then, Dr. Eichengreen, public debt is larger than national debt.
Right. In a
Interesting.
federal system where you have different levels of government, um, that is the case. In some smaller countries, government debt basically is limited. The only entity that borrows is the central government, in which case public debt and sovereign debt collapse into the same thing. But in most countries, there is some borrowing by subnational governments, so there the distinction is important.
I see. 2 points of clarification for me and our audience. One is sovereign debt is different than the phrase sovereign fund, right? Like, let's say they say, I don't know, Russia has 700, I don't know, million, whatever the number is, in sovereign fund. What's the difference?
Um, so there could be two differences.
Okay.
Again, sovereign refers to the national government or the highest level of government. Uh, so there is sovereign debt. There can also be uh, the funds of the sovereign. So the sovereign will have assets as well as liabilities. The Japanese government famously owns a lot of land and other
Well,
assets. Or you could be referring to sovereign wealth funds, which are these investment funds that governments operate. So the Saudi government, the Norwegian government, governments that are
yeah, yeah.
temporarily earning a lot of revenues by exploiting natural resources want to salt them away for future generations or invest them productively. So they invest them through their sovereign wealth fund. So that may be what you're hearing, what you're
Yeah,
referring.
yeah. So sovereign wealth fund is something that they stock away and they invest, and it also helps their currency exchanges.
And certainly, I don't know that it has a direct impact on the exchange rate. What has a direct impact on the exchange rate tends to be the fact that they are exporting a lot of oil and gas or
I see.
whatever, which puts upward pressure on the currency, on the exchange rate, creates what economists call Dutch disease
Dutch
problems.
disease. I
But
see.
that comes from the 1960s and 70s when the Dutch discovered a lot of natural gas in the North Sea, and their exchange rate strengthened. Their manufacturing sectors found it hard to compete internationally. Um, if the
Is that why they call it a disease? Because yeah,
That's why when we see a country that discovers natural resources, um, is able to export them in large amounts, experiences currency appreciation, and its manufacturing sector tanks. That's an undesirable
yeah, it's unfortunate.
and that's why it's called the Dutch disease.
My second follow-up question is this. You mentioned public debt. it consumes not just national debt, but also things such as state, provincial, I suppose, and also city and municipal debts. In your book, In Defense of Public Debt, you mostly talk about national debt, but you also mention these sub-sovereign debts, as you termed it. There's a special challenge with these types of debts. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. So, um, state and local governments have more limited ability to adjust taxes if they have to raise more revenue in order to service debts, because companies and households are footloose. If taxes are high in California, if we raise taxes again, there's the danger of people moving to Arizona or moving to Florida. So state and local governments are more constrained in terms of adjusting the tax base, if you will. And there's a second problem, that because of this, sometimes the central government feels compelled to bail out the states. If one state defaults on its debts, questions then arise about the solvency and the creditworthiness of other states, and you can get
A domino effect.
contagious crisis of confidence, just like you can get in a banking system. When Silicon Valley Bank fails, people begin to wonder about the solvency of First Republic and so forth. You can get those kind of spillovers between state finances as well. So sometimes the central government feels compelled to step in and assume responsibility for the debts of the states, to nationalize them,
I
if
see.
you will, and that can make what was reasonable sovereign debt balloon into unreasonable or unsustainable sovereign debt.
I learned a lot from two examples that you provided in your book. One was the famous case that was fundamental to our economy. Alexander Hamilton um, pushed for the federal government, the newly formed federal government, to assume the Revolutionary War debt of all states, even if Massachusetts has more debt than, let's say, Virginia. And there were compromises that were made. Many people know that story. The second thing that I learned is a case in which the federal government actually decided not to bail out states. And I think this was after the Panic of 1837, after Jackson's presidency. Many states, I think Illinois was one of them, I don't recall all of them, just borrowed, and many of them borrowed overseas, especially from Britain, and they defaulted. One of the challenges that I hope you can clarify for me is when a sub-sovereign entity, such as a state, defaults, for foreign lenders, that poses a problem because they can't directly push for them to pay back. I mean, I guess in the old days, they can't send troops, to have them pay back. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
That's a problem not only when sub-sovereign states borrow, but also when the sovereign itself borrows. So government enjoys sovereign immunity under international law. It can be sued only in its own courts when it extends permission to do so. So
that's bias, isn't it?
There are some funny exceptions to the rule. Hedge fund, a vulture fund, Elliott and Associates, a decade and more ago, tried to get around that problem after Argentina defaulted by seizing one of its naval ships.
In Spain, right?
I think it may have been in Ghana, actually.
Oh, I see.
Who cares? So the general point is that there is no bankruptcy court with enforcement powers for governments that borrow abroad. The main thing that compels governments to come to to try to maintain their good credit, to go back to the negotiating table when a bad thing happens, is they want to maintain their capital market access. They want to be able to borrow again in the future. So they have to give their creditors a reasonable deal when they run into difficulty. So we're seeing that right now with a wide variety of low-income countries. We've seen Zambia and Chad and Ghana and Sri Lanka engaged in negotiations with their creditors because they're not able to pay at the moment, given COVID and high commodity and energy prices and so forth. But they want to maintain or regain their access to international financial markets
because they want to borrow again.
So they can't be sued, but they can be threatened with lack of capital market access, and that's what makes governments come to the bargaining table and bargain in good faith in most cases.
You're talking about can't be sued. Let's go back to a time where even suing may not have even mattered. You mentioned sovereign funds, sovereign debt, and going back in time, that meant probably kings and emperors' debts. For what purpose did monarchs start borrowing money?
In almost all cases, in order to fight defensive and offensive wars. So all of a sudden, they had to raise more funds than could be conveniently raised by their little army of tax administrators, tax farmers, and the like. They had to pay mercenaries in order to defend their borders and themselves, or they were engaged in offensive wars. Either way, those were the typical circumstances under which monarchs would borrow. In the modern period, we see borrowing for investment in infrastructure. We see borrowing to meet other emergencies. The Italian city-states, I think Siena in the 14th century, borrowed to meet a public health emergency.
Wow.
The Black Death created expenses and depressed revenues. So that's a precursor to COVID-19.
And that's fascinating. I'm told one of the oldest banks in Italy was in Siena when I was touring. I don't know if that's true or not, but go ahead, please. You were going to add an additional point.
But the basic answer to your question is in order to meet military emergencies.
So in your book, examples of monarchs, kings and emperors borrowing goes all the way back to Rome. From whom did they borrow?
They borrowed from wealthy families and from private banks, which often was one and the same. So early banks, as in 13th and 14th century Italy, were privately owned and operated family banks where wealthy members of a family would pool their resources and they would lend to finance trade. They would provide credit to the Champagne fairs, the fairs in the Champagne region in what is now France, where
Champagne fairs,
where people would get together and trade. People would arrive there from far distant places in order to trade. Those family owned and operated banks would lend to the King of England or the King of Spain when those monarchs had reason to borrow of the sort I described before. So it's there were occasions where monarchs or Republican legislatures in Italian city-states imposed forced loans on their wealthy citizenry.
I love it. Forced loans. Okay.
You will buy these bonds. Was the dictate. But more often than not, it was through the good offices of these private bankers who were very much in the banking business, providing credit for trade, for various forms of investments, and to sovereigns who often had to pay an interest rate premium because of the risk that they might not repay what they borrowed.
This must, you mentioned interest rate premium. This must have been good business because many of these monarchs defaulted. For example, you mentioned Philip II of Spain, whom defaulted, I think, 4 times or something to that effect. And it must have been good business because people still lent to them eventually.
Yeah, so throughout history, we see that risky lending comes with an interest rate premium attached. It's a gamble where the lender is gambling that the extra interest income will compensate him for the risk of default, of non-repayment of not only interest due, but the principal amount as well. And you can see cases in the history where it works out and cases where it doesn't
Yeah.
work out, where the Bardi, one of the most famous Italian banking families, is basically bankrupted.
The
Uh,
Lombardi family?
Bardi with a B.
Bardi with a B, yeah. Um, we talked about champagne parties in the Champagne region in France, and we talked about Italy, England. I mentioned Rome. These are all Western nations, countries. We're talking about the Western civilization, quote unquote. I'm using that term as it was known back then. And in your book, you actually make a point that cases of Eastern civilizations, I'm using that term in quotations again, such as the Ottomans, going back to Persian empires, what have you, like Chinese empires, they did not borrow as much and as frequently. Did I get that point correctly?
You did. So the development of public debt, a market in public debt, is a Europe-centered phenomenon. We see this market develop in Europe really before it develops anywhere else. Attitudes toward indebtedness vary across societies and civilizations, to be sure, but I think the main factor here, and I take this insight from the late great historical sociologist Charles Tilly, who taught in
Yeah.
Wisconsin and elsewhere, was that it's really the political geography of Europe, which was divided into literally hundreds of fragmented regional states and city states, all of which butted up against one another, reflecting in turn Europe's physical geography as a continent divided by river valleys and mountain ranges and so forth. It was hard to unify the continent. The Romans managed to do it for a relatively brief historical period, if you will, but the historical regularity was Europe was divided into hundreds of territorial states and princely kingdoms and so forth, in contrast to most obviously China, much of which is a great plain
Yeah.
that was unified at a relatively early date, that was able to build a great wall to keep out the Mongol invaders, which didn't have to raise funds, didn't have to borrow in order to fight its neighbors to the same extent as was often the case in Europe. So the story we tell in the book, building on Tilly's work and the work of Jared Diamond, the historical anthropologist at
Yeah. Yeah.
UCLA, others, is that Europe's distinctive political, physical geography led to that distinctive political geography, which made Europe a continent of current wars, much more frequent wars than other parts of the world, which in turn created the need to borrow, the demand for loans, which was met by the growth of the infrastructure. The
Yeah.
banking families and others needed to supply them.
This is really fascinating. So more wars in Europe led to more borrowing, which in turn created the industry and the skills for borrowing, which we'll come to, and it becomes very useful in later centuries for infrastructure and other works.
I would just observe in passing that there is a large controversial literature about the role of war in European economic development more broadly, how European
Uh-huh.
states were able to harness military technology like cannon and gunpowder that was invented in the East, invented in China, but
Yeah.
not really harnessed and applied to the same extent as in Europe, where you had to figure out how to use the gunpowder or you would be overrun.
Obliterated. Yeah.
In China, they could take their time in developing the same expertise. So there's a financial story about war and financial development, but there's a broader story about war and economic development that you might or might not buy into.
No, that's really fascinating, which later led Europe, allowed Europe to somewhat dominate world politics and events, especially in the 19th century. And we'll be back after a short break to talk about democracy and debt. We'll be right back.